To the naked eye, the picture that we're looking at tonight might seem incredibly basic on first impressions, but believe it or not, we are looking at one of the most interesting, intricate, and detailed pieces of the entire Renaissance period. This painting is called The Ambassadors and was created in 1533 by Hans Holbein. This painting shows two men in a room. However, if we look in a greater detail and do a deep dive analysis, you'll see that there's much more to the painting than initially meets the eye. We're going to be talking about that in tonight's video, why this painting is so interesting, how the detail that you can see in this painting is secretly hidden, and why this is one of my favourite paintings of all time. Now we'll start off by saying, guys, if you do enjoy, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and as always, do remember, art is subjective and you may see different things to what I see. So if there's something that I missed, or if you have a different interpretation, let me know in the comment section and I'll try to get back to everybody that I can. Now, as I say, this painting was created in 1533. And this is one of the most intellectually complex pieces of the Renaissance period. It depicts two real historical figures which are standing beside an elaborately arranged table, and we can see this table here, and it is filled with scientific equipment. Zoom out a little bit and you can see it in its two layers. Now this is going to become very important in a moment. So in terms of what we're seeing here is scientific equipment, and we're also seeing luxury objects here too. Now the two figures are said to be Jean de Dinteville and George de Selve, and I tried to pronounce those two names as well as I could, by the way, guys. So at the time of the painting, these two were representatives of France in England during the reign of Henry VIII. So Holbein painted the scene with incredible realism, and this is one of the biggest things which we can see. And again, on initial inspection you may not see this, but if you zoom in, I want to really just highlight this. Look at everything on this painting, because the detail, never mind the meanings behind it, the detail here is something which we must first focus on. Look at this tablecloth. Look at the fabric, specifically which this man is wearing. This pink ruffled cloth or silk is incredibly well depicted by the artist. The quality here is second to none. Look at all of the creases. Look at the fur. Look at that fur, right? That is extremely detailed. Look at the pendant, and coming over to this character here, we see a very detailed cloth of silk too. Now, as someone who is an art enthusiast, as someone who tries to do the best art that I can in my spare time, let me tell you guys, this is the sort of thing which is essentially incredibly difficult to do. This is not easy. This in and of itself is a feat, especially for this time period. However, digging a bit deeper, not only do we see incredible realism here, but we also see that the painting is far more than a portrait. What does it really show? Well, it shows us a few things. It acts initially as a political statement, as many paintings do. It could be seen as a philosophical meditation, and it could also be seen as a scientific catalogue. Because if we think about this, and if we dig a bit deeper, we also see a warning of mortality. Now, where I see this is because Holbein in this painting constructs a visual argument about human knowledge when it comes to religion, division in society, and inevitably the reality of death. And this may seem a little bit complex at this point in the video. How does this simple painting show any of those things? Well, it actually does. It really, really does. And there's so many hidden meanings here. Let's just start off by acknowledging what some of them are. Now, I want to start off with a figure on the left. This is supposed to be Jean de Dinteville, and he stands here confidently in what appears to be very luxurious clothing. We can obviously tell by the opulence, by the amount of fabric used, by the style of the clothing, this would have probably been extremely expensive and well-to-do clothing for people of the time. So his outfit is obviously adorned with velvet robes. We can see a fur-lined coat. We can see ornate embroidery along his clothing. We can also see one thing which I think stands out a lot, which is a jeweled dagger. Now this is obviously in his hand. If you are able to find a bit more of an upscaled version of this painting, you can see that the dagger depicts 29. It has an inscription on it, and 29 is said to be his age at the time of this being created. Now this detail in and of itself helps to reinforce a Renaissance obsession that we see with identity and individual legacy. Again, this sword or this dagger He's got his current age embossed on it, and overall, he looks a very, very well-to-do person in this painting. Now, what does he represent given the context of all of this? Well, I'd say he represents a few things. Well, he clearly can be seen to represent political power due to his position as to what he did at this time. His clothing represents wealth. I think that's quite easy to understand. But also worldly authority, and his stance in and of itself tells a lot about this. He clearly looks confident. He's looking confidently at us. He is in a position here where he feels confident and he's kind of dominating the scene, especially compared to the second figure on the right, who we'll get to in a second. But he here essentially embodies the worldly and political elements of Renaissance life, right? He is someone who at this time would have probably been on top. He would have been wealthy, he would have been rich. His clothes look, in context, very good. He's someone who's on top in life. Now we move to the figure on the right. And this is said to be George's, or maybe perhaps Jorge de Selve. Unlike the character on the left, his clothing is a lot more restrained. It's a lot more clerical. He's not in particularly fancy clothing, especially compared to the figure on the left. He is in a lot more modest clothing, you could say. Now, what we see in terms of him is that he's leaning calmly against the table. He is almost in a contemplative state. This character on the left is very much dominating the scene. He's looking very confident towards us. This guy, he's still looking at us. He still has that confidence, but he's a lot more, perhaps, in a state of ponderance as he looks towards us. So he leans calmly on the table. He is with a book. We can see him, with a book, and this book is just here. And the book shows his age of 25. Now, this contrast between the dagger and the book, I think, is intentional, because I want you to think about this for a moment, okay? The dagger, and we'll go to this version of the painting, I had two. Well, the dagger, it can be seen as many things. I think that a dagger in this context shows, alongside the book, a dynamic of power. Because what is a dagger? Well, it's a weapon, okay? So what would a dagger represent? Well, it could represent conquering things. It could represent being in a great position of authority. All of these sorts of things, okay? And perhaps getting there by force, again, given the dagger. What, however, does a book represent? Well, in the context of this time especially, knowledge, and perhaps religious knowledge. So this could be something to think about in and of itself. He could be said to represent more of a religious and a religiously knowledgeable standpoint. And I think that is a big interpretation that I've taken from this one. So we see this person here alongside and almost contradicting the other character, because if we draw this painting down a line, and I hope you can see the mouse here, draw it straight down the middle, and I think this painting can be divided in 2 ways, but also in 4 ways, and we'll get to that in a moment. But dividing it down here, we can see a stark contrast between these 2 characters, and arguably as well, to some extent, between the information and stuff on their side of the table. So, like I say, he has a book, we know he has a knife or a dagger, but also, dividing it this way, this is the 2 polars of society, especially at this time, because, modesty, and especially in Christian values, these 2 are sort of contradictory, or at least at the opposite ends of the scale, to say the least. So, with that being the context, right, he thinks he's in the powerful position. The guy on the left, he's confident, his body's spread out, he's leaning towards us, he's looking confidently, and this guy, he's touching his robe, he's not looking as confident, but it's like he's got the assurance, and it comes from the book, perhaps the interpretation that this is 2 sides of society. A religious person who lives humbly and modestly, but is favoured and trusting of God, and someone who isn't. Now let's have a look at this painting in a different way. We see two shelves here, we've got a top and a bottom, and these themselves are very, very descriptive. The reason for this is because the upper shelf can be seen to represent the heavens. The reason for this is because it's filled with scientific knowledge. We can see this clearly on the table. And the bottom shelf, well, what does that show? It shows earthly and world and essentially human culture, right? These things are sort of divine. Not necessarily for the things that they show in terms of the scientific equipment in my eyes, but what the scientific equipment represents. The scientific equipment, well, it's not just about these things here, it's about forces which humans had to quantify and did not previously understand. We didn't know how things like gravity worked, we didn't necessarily know how things like time worked, and even if we did, these were forces that we could not and cannot still to this day can't control, really. At least even in our modern society, outside of controlled environments, right? And even in some instances, you still can't. Like, you can't control gravity. You know, you can do things to mitigate it. You can find circumstances on Earth where it might be lower or higher, but you can't do anything about gravity. You can't do anything about time, right? Not at all. That goes whether you like it or not. And all I'm trying to say here is, I think the tools or the things on the top shelf can be greatly misinterpreted, because you might be looking at this as, well, these things are tools. Well, in my opinion, they're not. In my opinion, they're more of a representation of forces that we cannot entirely quantify or have had to quantify, and we are not in control of. In contrast, the bottom, well, what do you see on the bottom shelf? Like I say, it is mainly worldly and human culture and creations. So, diving a bit deeper into that, we can see the two objects on the upper shelf, or the objects on the upper shelf generally, I should say. What are we looking at? We're looking at celestial globes, maps. We are looking at equipment to understand the cosmos, especially from this time period. In this time, astronomy was transforming and human understanding of the universe was growing. We know that in this era, we saw thinkers, many great thinkers from this time actually, which were beginning to challenge the idea that the Earth was the centre of the cosmos, which, you know, must have been groundbreaking for this time period. So, the globe can be seen to represent humanity's desire to map the universe, to understand the stars, to bring cosmic order into human knowledge. You know, we can see many different tools, sundials, and again, these appear at multiple points on the shelves. So you can see sundials, and I think their presence can represent the fact that we are trying to measure things, right? Humans are trying to measure time and planetary motions and positions, and perhaps, you know, the clocks and the sundials, as I should have said, are representative of the passing of time. And the passing of time in and of itself is representative of mortality, because we all have a limited amount of it. So I see that as one potential interpretation. You just, all of the forces on the top shelf, you just cannot stop. And all we have done, all the tools represent, is our attempt to understand them. And the lower shelves, well, that's mainly the human world. Now let's go down to those, because they are equally interesting in my opinion. So the lower shelf here, we can see earthly realism. We can see, instead of cosmic instruments, we're looking at objects that are related to human culture, mathematics, and music. Obviously, we've got some sort of an instrument here. We have books of different varieties, and we have a map, a globe, right? Now, unlike the globe that we saw on the top shelf, this globe is not celestial, right? This is a terrestrial globe. You can see the difference yet again by looking up here. Now, why does this matter? What does this difference show? Well, unlike the globe above it, this globe can be seen to represent the fact that global exploration during this time was growing, and recent voyages by explorers such as Christopher Columbus, for example, had expanded Europe's understanding of geography. The world was suddenly much larger than people thought, and Holbein subtly places France prominently. If we have a look on the map, you know, we can see this. Now, this could be significant in relation to the ambassador's homeland, right? Because, like we said, we use that ambassador, France. So this, as a representation, and we see this a lot, is a representation of things and identity. France, this guy's supposed to be from France, or he's the ambassador to France, that's all part of his identity. The clothes is part of his identity. This guy is a character. So I think that's interesting. Now, the instrument that we see here on the lower level is a lute, and the lute here has a broken string. Now, that can be seen as a massively powerful symbol. The lute is traditionally a instrument of harmony and balance. Music during the Renaissance period was believed to reflect the harmony of the universe, and Holbein here shows the instrument with a broken string. So that detail can symbolize the religious conflicts that we saw at the time, which were tearing Europe apart. In 1533, we'd seen the Protestant Reformation that had shattered the unity of Christianity. So the broken string, well, that can represent a few things. I can see this as discord, division, and potentially even the loss of harmony in Europe. Now, we've got the flute case, which we can see down here just a little bit lower. What is this, and why is this significant? Well, the case contains several flutes, but one of them is missing. Now, an incomplete set echoes the same symbolism of the broken lute. Harmony isn't there, it's incomplete, and Europe is culturally fractured. People are not living the way that perhaps they should. We've then got a arithmetic book, a mathematic book, a book said to be containing mathematical calculations. Mathematics during this time was symbolized in rational order, right? So humans believed that they could understand the unthinkable through logic and numbers, and that's what I mean. It was rational order, an attempt to understand a world that realistically we still don't know very much about, or at least that's my personal interpretation. So I think that yet again is a powerful symbol, that the mathematics, and we do see this even today all the time, right? People looking to quantify, and that brings me back to the second, or the first shelf, I should say, in a different way, because yet again it's people trying to quantify things which we just can't understand. So, despite all of this knowledge, these things, these factors, can irrespectively all existentially affect human or threaten humanity, from an existential standpoint, which, for all our knowledge, for all our equipment, for all our exploring, we still are beholden to external forces. And bringing this back to the religious scholarship on the right hand side, or the religious person, or what can be perceived to be the religious person, it's a very interesting angle to take. Then we have the hidden crucifix. Now, if you look very carefully at the upper left corner, and this is going to be hidden behind the curtain, partially hidden behind the curtain in the upper left corner, you can see a small crucifix. Now, why does that matter as a symbol in and of itself? Well, this is of course a painting with some religious elements. Now, this is particularly obscured, and that's for a good reason. You may not see this on first impressions, but if you can see the crucifix, why is this going to be there? Well, there's a reason. There's a few reasons, arguably, as well. I think the reason for this is because, if we think about the time period, religion still existed, but it may not have been at this point, and this might have been the time where it was really starting to break the cycle. It wasn't the main and central focus of life. The ambassador was focused on science, art, knowledge, and potentially even money as well. We can see in this context that God essentially is ushered to the edge of the image. He's been pushed to the edge of the image. He is not, unfortunately, the priority. What seems to be is all of these material goods and asinine attempts to quantify things which just can't be measured properly. Then we've got the distorted skull. Now you might be asking, what am I talking about here? And the reason why I can't really show you this right now is because you can't see it. This is, it doesn't really look like anything, but if you tilt the painting just so, you can see a skull. And that to me, it's this part here, by the way, if you're wondering, is particularly fascinating. The reason why I say that is because this is a piece of art that was way ahead of its time. You have to think about this. This was painted in the 1500s. And to use a tactic like this at this time was in and of itself incredible. On the surface, it looks like a bizarre shape, but like I say, if you tilt it or look at it from a certain viewpoint, it becomes a human skull. The technique is known as anamorphosis. I hope I pronounced that right, guys. I made some notes on this video, as I always do. Yeah, so the skull represents a classic Renaissance idea. That is the idea of memento mori. Remember, you must die. Holbein is trying to make a philosophical statement that despite all of the knowledge, wealth, power, and, all of these things that are displayed in the painting, they're both going to die. Death is going to dominate everything, and one day nothing in this image will exist anymore. So death is kind of the everything. It always is, it always will be. The skull literally disrupts the entire painting. It's kind of like a shadow being cast in front of this image. Yeah, we can, and looking at this, 500 years later, it's kind of like a snapshot in time. Nothing about this painting ostensibly is relevant anymore. The clothing doesn't really make sense to us. The housing style or what the building that they're in is not how anybody would decorate their house. It doesn't make sense, but we can see this as a historical period. But yet again, what has happened to all of the people in the image? Well, it's a thing that you can see before you. 300, 400, 500 years later, the skull, the life force is gone. It's been taken because death rules everything in a weird way. And that's the human element of mortality. So, death being shown in such a way at the forefront of the image, I think, is powerful. So what is the narrative of the painting? Well, I think this is quite hidden because Holbein here constructs a powerful but quiet image. And the narrative shows that the ambassador is standing proudly amongst the symbols of human achievement. We see him as the ambassador. We might recognize him, or we might have recognized him at this time for what he is, but he's a representation of all of us even to this day. Our things, our ownership, our assets, materials, financial, all of the things that we all take some pride in. But in reality, despite all of his science, exploration, music, his knowledge, and his political power, death lies beneath it all. And if you just see this image in the right angle, you can see how powerful of a force death is. The skull suggests that these achievements are just temporary illusions, and human civilization believes it's advancing towards greatness, yet the ultimate truth remains unchanged. We just can't beat death. Now, the painting was revolutionary for a number of reasons, the first of which is for having one of the first, if not the first, optical illusion in a major piece of Western art. This skull was the earliest dramatic use of this perspective distortion. It forces the viewer to physically move around the painting to understand it, and it has angles and elements that art of this time, really just did not use up to this period. We also see a hidden philosophical message here, like I say, mortality, religion, and knowledge alongside political instability. It's also a huge visible summary, or visual summary, of the Renaissance period. It shows us astronomy, it shows us geography, it shows us music, it shows us mathematics, it shows us politics and religion, it shows us wealth, it shows us power. But you know what? The same thing that we see in our modern society is true in this 500-year-old piece. We all succumb, no matter how rich we are, how wealthy we are, how successful we are, to the same ending. And in terms of that, the ambassador stands around the greatest knowledge of their age. This guy is around all of the symbolisms to quantify the world. Yet Holbein quietly places death in front of both of these men. It's visible only to us, the ones willing to look. They can't see it from their angle, but we can. And they've been especially this guy has been distorted, or his view has been distorted. He cannot even see his own mortality before him. So it takes a certain angle to look at it. And I think whilst that is a physical standpoint that you're going to have to make to look at this painting, I also think it is more of a message. Because we rush, and this is true for us even today, 500 years later, we rush around our lives. We do all of these things. We do all these things for status. We think we're on the forefront of humanity, and yeah, we are, but we fail to acknowledge our own mortality. And what does that say to me? Well, I don't know what it says to you guys, but it shows us the beauty and the significance and the importance of enjoying life, because it's not forever. It's not. So the message here is quite chilling. And, I think one key takeaway here is this guy on the left thinks he knows everything, or he thinks he knows everything that can be known from the angle of his time. But the one truth nobody can escape, you, me, and the people in the painting, the artist himself, is death. And we don't realise this until we look at it from a particular angle, So I don't know if this video made much sense. It's just my opinion, guys. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I'll see you again soon. Goodbye for now. See you soon.